Hello, my name is David Brown. I am a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ and an absolute lover of history, in particular, biblical history, ancient history, and African American history. Today's message that I want to share with you is entitled Raising Our Expectations Within the African American Community. This message will be broken down in three sections. The first section will deal with the importance and the value of knowing history. The second section will focus on that Black history that's beyond America and American slavery. And the last section, I'll dive into what it means to raise our expectations within the African American community and how we can elevate our vision of ourselves as a people and better determine what we want our future to look like. Okay? So I hope you enjoy. Let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so as we talk about the importance and the value of history, I want to share three famous quotes with you. The first is by author and historian David McCullough, who stated that history is who we are and why we are the way we are. Very profound. The second quote is by Frederick Douglass, author and famous abolitionist and one of the greatest orators in our history, stated that we have to do with the past only as we can make it useful for the present and for the future. And then the last quote is by Lerone Bennett Jr., the author of Before the Mayflower. He said, history is knowledge, identity, and power. I thought all those quotes were great and had a great impact upon me, and hopefully they will for you. Okay, history is the yesterday of mankind. It is the memory of men. And without knowledge of yesterday, without any memory, there is no guide for tomorrow. A society without history lacks direction. But men who are conscious of their past can improve their future. They know that the forces that have shaped the past are similar to those that shape the world they live in, and to those that will determine the future. History is a record of the past, of men and women, nations and events, and the conditions that brought them about, which is important to understand. The problem that I have is that some people's memory or their recollection of history is sometimes tainted or biased through ignorance or prejudice, whether it's racial or ethnic pride, and then also self-interest. And that's what we have to guard against. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about pride. Pride is to be lifted up, is to have an undue sense of one's importance. It's unreasonable conceit. And too many times, pride motivates us to exaggerate the importance of our own thoughts and opinions of ourselves over others. Now, there's a reason that I'm putting emphasis on this pride. I want to share with you a couple things that I've come across in my reading and studying Black history and Black history beyond America. There was an author, historian named Dr. Hugh R. Trevor Roper. He wrote in 1961 this: "Perhaps in the future, there will be some African American history or African history to teach. But at the present, there is none. There is only the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness, like the history of pre-European Columbian America. And darkness is not a subject of history." Misguided he is. Another quote, though, I want to share with you to emphasize my point. Arnold Toynbee wrote a study of history in 1934, and he made this statement: "It will be seen that when we classify mankind by color, the only primary race that has not made a creative contribution to any civilization is the Black race." Okay? Very difficult to read. But that's some of what's out there that I've come across. Okay? The people of African descent have long tried to control or to take control of the narrative of their own history, or at least make meaningful, honest, and credible contributions to this important academic. And as it stands today, there is still a resistance, a disregard, a systematic neglect by mainstream Western scholarship concerning Africa and her descendants, and the magnitude of their accomplishments and their contributions to human civilization. And Bible scholarship also, too often, have been disgraceful in their writing of history. And it needs to be addressed. Racial, ethnic, and spiritual pride must be rejected and overcome in these circles. What has been perpetuated in America's history lessons and her Christian literature provided a heritage for Blacks that associated us with service, slavery, savagery, barbarism, darkness, and limited success, while providing white America with a heritage of royalty, conquest, all things intellectual, light, power, influence, and unlimited success. Now, most people want to be associated with achievement, with greatness and heroism and royalty. Why? Because these things influence the way that we see ourselves and the way we feel about ourselves and our fellow man. So, my question was, why would those who oppress want to control the history of the oppressed? And Dr. Joseph Lowery provides an answer to that question. He stated, if you can wipe out a person's past, it then facilitates the controlling of his present and the shaping of his future. The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. So, one's belief concerning his or her origin will inevitably determine his or her belief concerning their purpose and destiny. That's very important. Matter of fact, King Solomon once stated in the Proverbs that as a people think in their hearts, so they are. And another quote that supports that is that a man is but the product of his thoughts. So, if our thinking shapes who we are, then it naturally follows that our potential is determined by our thinking. Matter of fact, Bob Gass, the author of The Word for the Day, stated that the mind is the birthplace for everything you do. So what we believe about ourselves matters. What we think about our own matters. Okay? Matter of fact, it was stated by John Maxwell, who's a tremendous author and leadership guru, stated in one of his books that we're going to touch on a little bit more later, that your life today is a result of your thinking yesterday. Your life tomorrow will be determined by what you think today. See, there's a correlation between one's level of thinking and one's level of progress. Okay, now let's move into the second section of this important message. And we're going to focus in on Black history beyond America and American slavery. And I'm going to share with you two significant sources that I think will help drive home the message without going too deep into it for this piece. The first is Lady Lugard. She was a British journalist and writer who lived in the late 19th century, early 20th century. But in 1905, she put together a work that was entitled A Tropical Dependency, an outline of the ancient history of Western Sudan. Okay, now here's what she had to say about some Black history. When the history of Negro land comes to be written in detail, it may be found that the kingdoms lying towards the eastern end of Sudan, classical home of the ancient Ethiopians, were the homes of races who inspired rather than races who received the tradition of civilization associated for us with the name of ancient Egypt. For they cover on either side of the upper Nile, between the latitudes of 10 degrees and 17 degrees, territories in which are found monuments more ancient than the oldest Egyptian monuments. If this should prove to be the case, and the civilized world be forced to recognize in a Black people the fount of its original enlightenment, it may happen that we shall have to revise entirely our view of the Black race and regard those who now exist as the decadent representatives of an almost forgotten era rather than as an embryonic possibility of an era yet to come. She goes on. She states, the fame of the ancient Ethiopians, ancient Kush, was widespread in ancient history. Herodotus describes them as the tallest and most beautiful and long-lived of the human races. And before Herodotus, Homer, in even more flattering language, described them as the most just of men, the favorites of the gods. The annals of all the great early nations of Asia Minor are full of them. The Mosaic records allude to them frequently. But while they were described as the most powerful, the most just, and the most beautiful of the human race, they are constantly spoken of as black. And there seems to be no other conclusion to be drawn than that remote period of history, the leading race of the Western world was a black race. And I say, wow, this just stunned me when I found it. And I want to analyze it just a little bit closer here before we move on to the next source here. The first thing that comes to my mind is the earlier British person, Hugh Trevor Roper, in 1961, stating that there was no black history to write about, okay? But here in 1905, you have another British person bringing out all this history and herself realizing that if this history is true, it's going to change the view that whites have of black people. But let's go through it here, okay? So she said that there is history in Negro land and it's waiting at the time to be written in detail, okay? She talked about kingdoms in the Sudan. Think about that. Kingdoms, plural, and kingdoms have kings. They have queens and royalty, okay? And contrast that with dark Africa, savagery and barbarism. Okay? There were kingdoms. She stated that the Ethiopians inspired the traditions of civilization that has been associated or given credit or credit given to Egypt. Now that's a major statement. And she didn't make that up, okay? There's writings and archaeological finds to support that, but we're not going to get into that right now. She goes on to say that Ethiopia has monuments more ancient than Egypt. And again, you got to say, hold on, wait a minute. Monuments, meaning pyramids. Yes, they built pyramids before the Egyptians. So that means engineering, mathematics, that means organization, architect. It means all those things, gifts that these Ethiopian people possessed, okay? Now, she said, if this should prove to be the case and the civilized world be forced to recognize in a black people the fount of its original enlightenment, it may happen that we, whites, shall have to revise entirely our view of the black race. Powerful. And yes, they need to review how they see black people based upon this history. And so do we. The other critical information we learned in her writings is that the ancient Ethiopians enjoyed widespread fame among nations. Okay? And I plugged in here another source that could support that comment by a German historian and writer by the name of A.H. Hereen. Okay, and he lived and wrote also in the 19th century. And this is his statement. He said, when the Greeks scarcely knew Italy and Sicily by name, the Ethiopians were celebrated in the poems of their bards or their poets. They were the remotest nation, the most just of men, the favorites of the gods. The lofty inhabitants of Olympus journey to them and take part in their feast. That was his statement, okay? And if you think about the nations who knew of the Ethiopians, of course, it included Egypt itself, Assyria, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, all knew of these Ethiopians. Okay, so their fame was widespread. Okay? And she goes on to talk about what Herodotus wrote relative to these Ethiopians. He described them as the tallest, most beautiful, and long-lived of the human races. That's how they saw our ancestors. Homer, who is recognized as the prince of poets, described them as the most just of men, the favorites of the gods. And I have to say, we need to pause here. The most just of men. That was their reputation of being a people who understood justice. And they themselves were a just people, more so than any other nation of people that the Greeks had interacted with. That's a powerful statement, okay? But it makes sense because from our beginnings in America, and there are writings of both free and a handful of slaves who were able to obtain some education, and they wrote about the injustices that they were living with. And it didn't matter what white Americans were saying because it didn't line up with true justice. They claimed to love justice, but their walk didn't line up with their talk. Okay? And we've always understood that. Okay? But now it makes more sense to me. All right? She goes on to say the annals of all the great early nations of Asia Minor are full of the Ethiopians. Okay? And annals, again, records of events year by year. So it's documented, okay? Sounds like a land and a people with a whole lot of history, okay? And then she states the Mosaic record alludes to them frequently. And I thought about that, and of course I've looked it up, and sure enough, if you pay attention, in the book of Genesis, Moses, in giving the genealogy from Noah and his three sons, we read about King Nimrod, who was a Cushite king who's described as being a mighty hunter before the Lord. And no, not a hunter of the souls of men like some have claimed, in the 19th and 20th century. Okay, if you look up the word mighty, hero, that word mighty is gibor, which means hero in the Hebrew. So he was a hero hunter before the Lord, and he built kingdoms, plural, that are laid out there in Genesis, the 10th chapter. Okay, and Moses talked about his wife, which was an Ethiopian woman. He married a Cushite woman, okay? And then there's Phinehas, the priest, the Nubian, the Negro. So, yes, the Mosaic records alluded to these Cushites, okay? And she said, while all these things are said about them, what stood out to her is that they were constantly described as being black. Okay? The reason why that's important is because some writers and historians and geographers of the 19th century tried to come along and say, hey, the Nubians, the Egyptians, Ethiopians, or Abyssinians were really white, that they were not black. And the Bible teaches us different, and ancient historical records teach us differently. They were black. Okay? And then her last statement was, the leading race of the Western world in remote history was a black race. Okay? Let's quickly move on here to the second source. It's called the Encyclopedia of Biblical Literature. And it was compiled by John McClintock and James Strong. Both were Methodist. One was a Methodist Episcopal theologian, McClintock, and educationalist. And the other was an American Methodist biblical scholar and educationalist. Okay? And by the way, James Strong is the one who compiled the Strong Concordance that's used globally by theologians and those that study the Bible and the Hebrew and Greek language. Okay, so two heavyweights. So within this Encyclopedia of Biblical Literature, this is some of what they stated relative to Ethiopians. There is every reason to conclude that the separate colonies of priestcraft spread from Meroe into Egypt. And the primeval monuments in Ethiopia strongly confirm the native traditions reported by Diodorus Siculus, who was a Greek historian who lived in Rome, that the worship of Zeus Ammon originated in Meroe. Also, the worship of Osiris. This would render highly probable the opinion that commerce, science, and art descended into Egypt from the Upper Nile. The Upper Nile. Hang on to that. They go on to say Herodotus called the Ethiopians wise men occupying the Upper Nile. Men of long life whose manners and customs pertain to the Golden Age. Mind-boggling. Those virtuous mortals whose feasts and banquets are honored by Jupiter himself. Those were the words of Herodotus, a Greek who is recognized as the father of history. Okay? And then they talk about Isaiah in the Bible. So Isaiah often mentions Ethiopia and Egypt in close political relations. In fine, the name Ethiopia chiefly stood as the name of the national and royal family of Egypt. In the beginning, Egypt was ruled from Ethiopia. Ethiopia was ruined by her wars with Egypt, which she sometimes subdued and sometimes served. And then their last statement here. The early prosperity and grandeur of Ethiopia sprang from the carrying trade of which it was the center. Between India and Arabia on the one hand, and the interior of Africa and especially Egypt on the other, there was an intimate connection between Egypt and Ethiopia commercially. Thebes and Meroe founded a common colony in Libya. Now that's a lot to wrap our minds around. But this is some of the history of our ancestors that has been hid from us, veiled from us. That's important for us to know to help us know who we are and why we are the way we are. That will help us gain knowledge to understand our identity and to understand our potential, which could produce power in our lives. And I'm talking power to do good. Okay? I'm talking power to be better and to understand the standard and the bar that's been set by our ancestors, and we raising our expectations to reach that bar. So as we move into this last section, I want to do so posing a question to you for you to answer for yourself. What expectations do you have for yourself, for your family, for your career, for your schooling? What expectations do you have as a believer if you're a man or a woman of faith? Expectations are important. Let me share another quote with you here from Karen Ford of Mary Kay Products. She stated that people will never attain what they cannot see themselves doing. Very thought-provoking. Expectations are born out of our beliefs. The definition for expectation is a strong belief that something will happen in the future. It is anticipation of some future event. Now, I want to just share a couple scriptures with you so we can see that God has certain expectations for us and what we should expect from him, okay? The first I'll share with you is Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11, and it states, "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not evil, to give you an expected end." Wonderful passage. Another one that I'll share with you is from Proverbs, the 10th chapter, verse 28. And it states, "The hope of the righteous shall be gladness, but the expectation of the wicked shall perish." Okay? And the last one is from Micah 6:8. And it states, "He hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God." Okay, expectations. And then I pulled together just a few quotes on expectations that I wanted to share with you. The first one states that, "Blessed is he who expects nothing, for he shall receive it." Benjamin Franklin. The second one states that, "I find my life is a lot easier the lower I keep my expectations." Bill Watterson. And then there's one from Michael Jordan. And it states that, "If you accept the expectations of others, especially those negative ones, then you will never change." Okay? And change is what we want for better. Okay? And then there's a quote that I put together just based upon the things that I'm learning and what I realize. And it states that without setting expectations, people's tendency is not to stretch themselves or challenge themselves, which I think is very important. And I'll end the quotes with this: "Our expectations have a tremendous impact on our attitudes." And that quote is from John Maxwell. And this next section that I'm going to cover, I actually pull from one of his works, a book that's called Thinking for a Change. Okay? And we'll wrap it up with this. So he talks about how progress could be made by changing the way we think. And the first thing that he said was, changing your thinking changes your beliefs. And changing your beliefs changes your expectations. And I have to pause there. A belief is not just an idea that you possess. It is an idea that possesses you. A belief holds great power. Why? Because it changes an individual's expectations. Okay? So changing your thinking changes your beliefs. Changing your beliefs changes your expectations. Changing your expectations changes your attitude. Now, I'm going to pause again. Negative expectations lays the work or the groundwork for defeat before you even begin. Okay? And there was another quote in his book that really hit home with me. And it states that the greatest detriment to many people's success tomorrow is their thinking today. If their thinking is limited, so is their potential. But if people can keep growing in their thinking, they will constantly outgrow what they're doing, and their potential will be off the charts. Okay? So, negative thinking will bring about defeat, but positive thinking can change our lives here. So because a positive attitude brings commitment and energy and those important characteristics that help a person to achieve success in life. Now, so changing your attitude changes your behavior. Have you ever noticed how your mood affects the way that you act? You know, when you're happy, you're kind, you're energized. But when you have a bad day, you're short with people, you're rude, you're inconsiderate, and sometimes just flat out mean. Okay? Or the attitude that I've never won anything before in my life, so why go on trying? Why should I try God? He's never done anything for me. So attitudes are important. Psychologist William James stated that which holds our attention determines our actions. So your behavior follows your attitude. The two cannot be separated. Okay, so changing your behavior changes your performance. And changing your performance can change your life. It can change your life. So, if I keep improving my thinking, it will impact my beliefs, which changes my expectations, which affect my attitude, which changes my behavior, which improves my performance, and that will change my life. Now, we all know that in order to make progress in our own lives and in our communities, we need to also change our behavior. And with changing our thinking and what we believe about who we are and about what our potential is as a people, it can change our attitude. And that attitude can change our behavior. And our behavior change our performance because we act differently, we do things differently, we plan, we execute, and we believe that we can reach the bar that was set by our ancestors and others. So with that, thank you for listening and being a part of this. And there's much more to come. Please pray for me. Thank you.